Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. I am your host, Gabe, and today we're going to be talking about the Siege of Bexar. The Siege of Bexar was an early campaign of the Texas Revolution in which a volunteer Texian army defeated Mexican forces at San Antonio de Bexar. The Siege of Bexar was from October 12th through December 11th, 1835. In 1835, Federalists in several interior Mexican states revolted against the increasingly centralist reign of Mexican President Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. The Texans staged a minor revolt against customs duties in June, and wary colonists soon began forming militias ostensibly to protect themselves. As protests spread across Texas, Mexican officials increasingly blamed the settlers from the United States for the discontent. As historian Alan Barr noted, many of the new settlers had lived entirely within growing Anglo colonies and had made a few adjustments to the Spanish traditions of Mexico. Fearing that strong measures were needed to quell the unrest, Santa Anna ordered General Martin Perfecto de Cos to lead a large force into Texas. When Cos arrived in San Antonio on October 9th, there were 647 soldiers ready for duty. When Goliad fell to the Texans, Cos lost his line of communications to the coast. Convinced that the Texans would soon attack San Antonio, he chose to take a defensive position rather than launch an attack against the Texian army. On October 12th, the Texan army numbered approximately 300 men, drawn primarily from Austin's colonies and the DeWitt colony. About half of the men had entered Texas in the 1820s. The others were new arrivals who lived in the area less than 5 years. Several had official militia experience while they lived in the United States, and others had joined companies within Texas to counter Indian raids. Almost all the men were proficient with firearms, as hunting was a primary source of the food. The men crossed the Guadalupe River that morning and paused to await further reinforcements from Nacogdoches. On October 13th, Austin led the Texian army towards San Antonio de Bexar, location of the last large garrison of Mexican troops in Texas. Some of the Texans had no weapons; those that did have little gunpowder or shot. As the army marched, Ben Milam formed a makeshift mounted company to scout ahead. On October 15th, one of the scouting parties briefly skirmished with the 10-man Mexican cavalry patrol. No injuries were reported, and the Mexican soldiers soon retreated to Bexar. The Texans arrived at Cibolo Creek, several miles east of Bexar, on October 16th. Austin requested a meeting with Cos, but Cos declined to meet with a man he said was commanding an illegal force. A Texan council of war decided to remain in place and wait for reinforcements. The following day, they reversed their decision, and Austin moved his army to Salado Creek, 5 miles from Bexar. Over the next several days, reinforcements and supplies arrived from various English-speaking colonies. One of the new companies, commanded by James C. Neal, brought 2 6-pound cannons with him. The reinforcements brought the Texan official strength to 453 men, although only about 384 of them were able for duty. On October 24th, Austin wrote the Committee of Public Safety in San Felipe that he had commenced the investment of San Antonio, and that with additional reinforcements he believed the town could be taken in a matter of days. Meanwhile, Cos worked to fortify the town squares in San Antonio and the walls of the Alamo. A mission turned forward near the town. By October 26th, Cos's men had mounted 11 cannon, 5 in the town squares and 6 on the walls of the Alamo. An 18-pounder cannon with a much longer range than the other Mexican artillery was positioned inside the Alamo Chapel. Additionally, Mexican soldiers arrived in Bexar, and on October 24th, the Mexican garrison stood at its highest number, 751 men. Although the Mexican soldiers attempted to restrict access to and from the city, James Bowie was able to leave his home and join the Texans. Bowie was well known throughout Texas for his fighting prowess, and stories of his exploits in the sandbar fight and in search for the lost San Saba mine were widely reported in Texas at that time. Juan Seguin, a government official in San Antonio, arrived with 37 Tejanos on the morning of October 22nd, and later that day an additional 76 men joined the Texian army from Victoria, Goliad, and the ranches south of Bexar. According to Barr, the presence of the Tejanos helped to blur the essence of ethnic conflict, providing evidence that the Texan response was not simply an overreaction by American immigrants. Even with additional men, Austin realized that his army was not large enough to prevail in a full assault on Bexar. The Texans thus prepared for a siege, looking for a position that was, in the words of historian Stephen L. Harding, near Bexar yet defensible against a sorta in a position to block enemy communications arriving daily. On October 22nd, Austin named Bowie and Captain James W. Fannin commanders of the 1st Battalion and sent them on a reconnaissance mission. By the end of the day, the Texans had seized the Espada mission from Mexican pickets. On October 24th, Austin informed the Committee of Public Safety that he had initiated a siege. In his opinion, the city would be taken in a few days if Texan reinforcements arrived quickly. Austin sent Bowie and Fannin to another good defensive spot on October 27th. Rather than return immediately to Austin as their orders specified, Bowie and Fannin instead sent a courier to Austin to take directions to their chosen campsite, the former mission Concepcion. The scouting party camped along the San Antonio River near the mission, which was approximately 2 miles from San Antonio to Bexar, and 6 miles from the Texan camp at Espada. An angry Austin, fearing that his army would be easily defeated now that it was split, issued a statement threatening officers who chose not to follow orders with court-martial. He ordered the army to be prepared to join Bowie and Fannin at first light. Hoping to neutralize the Texan force at Concepcion before the remainder of the Texan army arrived, Coase ordered Colonel Domingo Urtecha to lead an early morning assault on the forces at Concepcion on October 29th. The Texans had a good defensive position, surrounded by trees, which left the Mexican cavalry no room to maneuver. The Mexican infantry soon found themselves outgunned, and their Brown Bess muskets had a maximum range of only 70 yards compared to the 200-yard effective range of the Texan long rifles. The Texans were short of ammunition, however, and although Mexican ammunition was plentiful, it was poor quality. In several cases, Mexican musket balls bounced off Texan soldiers, causing little damage other than a bruise. The Battle of Concepcion lasted only 30 minutes, and at this point, the Mexican soldiers retreated towards Bexar. Less than 30 minutes after the battle ended, the rest of the Texan army arrived. Austin felt that the Mexicans' morale must be low after their defeat and wanted to proceed immediately to Bexar. Bowie and the other officers refused, as they believed Bexar was too heavily fortified. The Texans searched the area for any Mexican equipment which had been abandoned during the retreat. They found several boxes of cartridges. Complaining that the Mexican powder was little better than pounded charcoal, the Texans emptied the cartridges but kept the bullets. One Texan, Richard Andrew, died and was wounded, while estimates of the Mexicans dead ranged from 14 to 76. On November 1st, Austin sent a note to Coase suggesting that the Mexican army surrender. Coase returned the note unopened with a message that he refused to correspond with rebels. Austin sent men to reconnoiter the town's perimeter and discovered that the fortifications within the city were stronger than the Texans had believed. On November 2nd, Austin called for a council of war, which voted to continue the siege and wait for reinforcements and more artillery before attacking. Members of the Texan army were impatient to begin the fighting, however. Austin complained to the provisional government on November 4th that this force, it is known to all, but undisciplined militia in some respects of very discordant materials. He followed this note with a strong plea that in the name of Almighty God, send no more ardent spirits to this camp. The siege continued, and soon additional reinforcements under Thomas J. Rusk, bringing the Texan army to 600. Coase also gathered reinforcements, bringing the Mexican army to 1,200 and discouraging the Texans even further from making any direct assaults on the city. Sam Houston arrived in San Felipe expecting to gather for a meeting of the consultation of the government. But since many of the members were fighting in the siege of Bexar, Houston instead went to the Texan army outside San Antonio. When Houston arrived in the camp, Austin offered him command of the army, but Houston declined and went ahead gathering the members of the consultation. The members were released from the army for the meeting, and they returned to San Felipe. There, the delegates agreed to fight and uphold the Constitution of 1824 rather than Texas independence. Houston was named General-in-Chief of all Texas forces except those fighting around San Antonio, and Stephen F. Austin was authorized to travel to the U.S. to gain support for their cause. Edward Burleson had been serving as Austin's second-in-command, and he was elected Major General Commander-in-Chief of the Volunteer Army to replace Austin. Texan morale began to drop severely, and with winter approaching and supplies running low, Burleson continued withdrawing into winter quarters. In a council of war, Burleson officers overruled his decision to withdraw, and the army stayed. One of the officers who had mandately opposed the withdrawal was Colonel Ben Milam. Undaunted, Milam stalked into the Texan camp and called out, "Who will go with old Ben Milam into San Antonio?" 300 soldiers cheered for their support for Milam. Reports from a captured Mexican soldier and escaped Texan prisoner alerted Burleson that Mexican morale was just as low. Burleson ordered a 2-column attack. One attack was to be carried out by Milam's troops, and the other was to be carried out by those of Colonel Francis W. Johnson. On December 5th, Milam and Johnson launched a surprise attack and seized 2 houses in the military plaza. The Texans were unable to advance any further that day, but they fortified the houses and remained there during the night, digging trenches and destroying nearby buildings. On December 7th, the attack continued, and Milam's force captured another foothold in the city. However, Milam was killed while leading the attack. Colonel Johnson subsequently took both of his and Milam's men and continued the street fighting, gradually driving the Mexicans back into the city. Coase withdrew into the Alamo, where he was joined by Colonel Ugartecha and 600 reinforcements, but it was too late. Coase entrenched his position, and the Texan artillery pounded the fort mission. As the Texans advanced closer to the plazas, Coase realized that his best defensive position would be within the Alamo mission just outside Bexar. In his official report to Santa Anna, Coase wrote that in such critical circumstances that there was no other measure than to advance and occupy the Alamo, which, due to its small size and military position, was easier to hold. In doing so, I took with me the artillery, packs, and the rest of the utensils I was able to transport. At 1 a.m. on December 9th, the cavalry began to pull back towards the Alamo. Colonel Nicholas Condell, his small force of 50 men from the Morelos and Tamaulipas unit, and 2 cannons remained as the rear guard at the plaza. Years later, however, Sanchez Navarro remained that Coase was not planning to abandon the town but wished to move his wounded to relative safety of the Alamo. Inside the Alamo, Coase presented a plan for a counterattack. Cavalry officers believed that they would be surrounded by Texans and refused the order. Possibly 175 soldiers from 4 of the cavalry companies left the mission and rode south. According to Barr, Coase ran after the horsemen to tell them to stop and was almost run down. For a brief period, those in the mission believed that Coase might have been killed. Sanchez Navarro said the troops were not deserting but misunderstood their orders and were withdrawing all the way to the Rio Grande. By daylight, only 120 experienced infantry remained in the Mexican garrison. Coase called Sanchez Navarro to the Alamo and gave him orders to go save those brave men, approach the enemy, and obtain the best terms possible. Sanchez Navarro first returned to his post at the plaza to inform the soldiers of the imminent surrender. Several officers argued with him, explaining that the Morales battery has never surrendered. But Sanchez Navarro held firm to his orders. Bugle calls for a parley received no response from the Texans, and at 7 a.m. Sanchez Navarro raised a flag of truce. Father de la Garza and William Cook came forward to escort Sanchez Navarro and 2 other officers to Johnson, who summoned Burleson. When Burleson arrived 2 hours later, he found the Mexican soldiers did not have written authorization from Coase. One of the Mexican officers was sent back to bring formal permission for their surrender. Burleson agreed to an immediate ceasefire and negotiations began. Johnson, Morris, and James Swisher represented the Texans, while Jose Miguel de Arcienda and John Cameron interpreted. The men haggled for much of the day before reaching terms at 2 a.m. on December 10th. According to the terms of the agreement, Mexican troops could remain in the Alamo for 6 days to prepare for the trip to the Mexican interior. During that time frame, Mexican and Texan troops were not to carry arms if they interacted. Regular soldiers who had established ties in the area could remain in Bexar. All recently arrived troops were expected to return to Mexico. Each Mexican soldier would receive a musket and 10 rounds of ammunition, and the Texans would allow 1 4-pound cannon and 10 rounds of powder and shot to accompany the troops. All other weapons and all supplies would remain with the Texans, who agreed to sell some of the provisions to the Mexicans for their journey. As the final term for their parole, all of Coase's men were required to pledge that they would not fight against the Constitution of 1824. At 10 a.m. on December 11th, the Texan army paraded. Johnson presented the terms of surrender and asked for the army's approval, stressing that the Texans had little ammunition left to continue the fight. Most of the Texans voted in favor of the surrender, although some termed it a child's bargain, too weak to be useful. The Siege of Bexar was the longest Texan campaign of the Texas Revolution, and according to Barr, it was the only major Texan success other than San Jacinto. According to Barr, of the 780 Texans who had participated in some way in the battle, between 30 to 35 were wounded, with 5 or 6 killed. Historian Stephen Harding placed the Texan casualties slightly lower, with 4 killed and 14 wounded. The losses were spread evenly amongst Texan residents and newcomers from the United States. Although some Texans estimated that as many as 300 soldiers were killed, historians agree that it was likely a total of 150 Mexican soldiers were killed or wounded during the 5-day battle. About 2/3 of the Mexican casualties came from the infantry units defending the plazas. To celebrate their victory, Texan troops threw a fandango, and on the evening of December 10th, Governor Henry Smith and the Governing Council sent a letter to the army, calling the soldiers invincible and the brave sons of Washington and freedom. After the war, those who could prove they had participated in this campaign were granted 320 acres of land. Eventually, 504 claims were certified. And that is it for the Siege of Bexar. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope